So good evening, everybody. We will get going. Welcome to our April meeting of the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. I'm Julie Potter. I'm the chair. We will normally go around do introductions, so we will do that. Bonnie?
Bonnie Waninger, staff.
Bill Aaron, Worcester.
Don LaHaye, Waitsfield.
Ron Krause, Middlesex.
Rich Turner, Williamstown.
Jerry D'Amico, Roxbury.
Michael Gray, Woodbury.
Steve Lotspeech, Waterbury.
Bob Warnick, Berlin.
Byron?
Byron. You need help with that?
Yeah, please. I hope I can get off this.
Jana Shandy, Berry City.
Clare Rockstar.
Paul Emery, Plainfield.
Amy Horglass Cabot.
Alan Questbush, Duxbury.
Laura Lee Banks, Northfield.
And
Dara Torrey, Moortown.
welcome, everybody. So we have a full agenda tonight, so I'm not going to spend too much time dawdling. And so we'll jump right in. If you are hungry and want to get something more to eat, just come up and get it. Do we have anybody who's got public comments this evening?
Oh, that's not public. I was gonna say thanks.
And do we have any adjustments to the agenda? Bonnie has some notices as an
just
adjustment to
have
the agenda.
a few things from Nancy. My favorite pizza is, so we gave you their menu, plus you can tell us you like specific things, if I could pass them both. Whoa.
Ordering is hard.
This is the important stuff to
This is
start
the
the meeting
important step,
with.
yes. For those of you who have not signed the conflict of interest policy, Nancy left copies with your name on it. If you could please do that, that would be great. She's on vacation right now, so I'm doing her due diligence. And that's it.
Okay.
Unless I told you something else.
Our first presentation this evening is Essentials of Land Use Planning. And this is with Clare Rock, our senior planner. And Clare, I'm going to turn this over to you. Clare's presentation is intended to give us some background so that we're all on at least the same basic footing when Bonnie gets up to talk.
Hi. Great. So you'll see the title of my presentation was Essentials of Land Use Planning. It is going to be different from the essentials training you may have seen before. So it's more of just a timeline of the history of planning in Vermont, which I think then will set the stage for the next conversation about Act 250. So I'm going to see if this is going to work if I just use it like this.
That's better.
How do I go back?
There, it said previous.
Yeah, so how do I get that?
The building's getting in. There it is.
Well, I figured this out.
Just use the back arrow.
When you get there, would you like me to drive?
Here we go. Well, now you see my presentation. I'm just hoping, I was seeing if I could use this on this side. Let me try one more time. I can't tell where this is wanting to look at for it to work.
Right.
Oh, there we go. I'm standing in a new way. Okay, so we'll just get started here. So this was 1875, and there was a fire that swept through downtown Montpelier. And from there, the select board decided to adopt some regulations that said, if you're going to build again in our downtown, it has to be made out of stone or brick. And so some would say this might be the start of the land use regulation in Vermont. But technically, it didn't really start until the 20s. And so this handy timeline that I have taken from this report, Vermont by Design, that was done back in 2006 by the Vermont Council on Planning, has a great history, and this is where I stole this timeline from. So I'm going to kind of go through this timeline and point to some of the relevant pieces that I think would be worthy to note. So in the 1920s is when we first had the first law of planning, which basically enabled the planning commissions and their ability to draft a plan in Vermont. Following that, not too long after, but by the early 30s, there was a first law on zoning that enabled the planning commissions to, and also the Board of Adjustments to enact zoning regulations. And at that same time, there was a statewide commission that started putting together some planning recommendations for the state of Vermont. And those planning recommendations were very much rooted in kind of what we recognize as our Vermont landscape and the rural landscape and the villages. In 1965, the planning office was formed at the state level. And then by 1968, there was the first model law on planning and zoning in Vermont. And I think my little chapter 117 was the thing moved there. So that was basically where we're seeing the foundation of what we know today as chapter 117. This is when it was enacted. It was in the late 60s where the regional planning commissions were being formed. And then there was this central planning office, which was renamed the state planning office. So this is kind of, this state agency had been developed to address some of the planning concerns, and it was going through some different changes and being moved around and being called different names. By the 1970s is when we see Act 250 being passed into law. And I'm going to take a moment just to talk about, what is Act 250. So basically, the reason why Act 250 was enacted was because of what was happening in Vermont at the time. This is a picture of the construction of the interstate. This is actually, I believe, in Middlesex. If you're looking north, I think you'll see the settlement farm kind of in the distance there, and now that new bridge, which has been under construction recently, is kind of what would be here in the foreground where those trees are. So Vermont now is being opened up to all the metropolitan areas. It was now easy to get here from places like Boston and New York City, and people were coming because we had places like this. This is Killington, and also I think a picture, I think that might be Sugarbush that appeared on the cover of Vermont Life magazine. So development pressure was increasing in Vermont, and under the leadership of Governor Davis, Act 250 was passed. And the primary purpose of Act 250 was because of the environmental impacts that the state was starting to see from the large development that was happening, primarily due to the interstate construction and Vermont being recognized as a place where people wanted to come. And so, like I mentioned, the purpose of the law was to regulate the environmental impacts of large-scale development. And at that time, there were very few towns that actually had local zoning. I think around this time, about 30 to 35 towns in Vermont were regulating land use at the local level. And so the governor said, we really need to be able to manage the impacts here. And so what I've listed here is the type of projects that Act 250 regulates. They don't regulate all the projects that are happening in Vermont. And I think a recent study showed I think about a quarter to a third of all projects in Vermont are under Act 250 jurisdiction. So only a portion of development in Vermont actually falls under Act 250 jurisdiction. And what they are regulating is development that's happening at high altitudes, high elevations. They're regulating large-scale industrial commercial activities. That is going to be different in a town that does not have zoning. If you don't have zoning, they're going to regulate commercial development that's happening on an acre or more. If you do have subdivision and zoning regulations, then Act 250 is going to be triggered when there's being proposed on 10 acres or more. It's going to be, you're going to need an Act 250 permit if you're going to be proposing to build 10 or more dwelling units or doing a larger subdivision. So those are some of the kinds of things that Act 250 was intended to regulate and still regulates today. And if you want to know kind of more about the specifics of what actually it does regulate, there is on the Act 250 website, there's a lot of information there if you want to know more specifically about the different types of development. But that's kind of an overview of what Act 250 regulates. I'm not going to read off to you this, but basically, in addition to saying these are all the things we regulate, these are the types of things we want to review We want to know what the impacts of your development are going to be on all of these criteria. So the majority of these are all environmental based criteria. They're going to be measuring the impacts of Act 250 on a lot of our natural resources. Generally, these have all remained the same. There have been additional kind of sub-criteria added over the years. These are all the criteria where they talk about Act 250-10 criteria. This is what they're talking about. When you submit an application, you have to show what its impacts are going to be on all these resources. Criteria 10 is the criteria which relates to municipal plans and regional plans. What that other criteria is basically looking at is the proposal in conformance with the regional plan and the local plan. So back to the timeline, we talked about what happened in 1970 with Act 250. Following that, there was also proposed a statewide interim capability plan. And we actually have a copy of that in our office. This was designed, I think, to be a guidance document for Act 250. It was supposed to be that statewide land use plan that would direct, where are the areas where we want to see development, where are the areas where we don't want to see development. And there were subsequently a series of maps that went along with this for each of the regions. And so that was proposed. It never happened, though. They presented it to the legislature multiple times during the 70s, I believe, and it never got passed. So this piece of it was never enacted, and so that may be something that you hear referenced in the discussions about some of the changes that they're proposing. Let's see, what else happened during that time? In the 70s and 80s, there were some changes to Act 170, to Chapter 117, mostly dealing with our zoning regulations and the process of administering those zoning regulations. And then you'll see in 1984, the legislature says, you know what, let's just remove this proposal to adopt this plan. So in 1984, that's kind of, now it's off the table.
Claire, can you take a couple of questions as you go along?
Sure.
Amy, you had a question.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was, at the top of that last slide said, major, yeah, what would I say, thank you, for major development, and actually, there's no criteria that has to be major. My understanding is that if it's anything commercial, it could be tiny and minuscule, but if it's on a plot that's bigger than, whether it's 1 acre, with no zoning, or some towns choose to be 1 acre towns too, right, even though they have zoning, and then 10 acres, so it pretty much anything commercial, like even a farmer's market, I happen to know, would falls under Act 250. So I'm wondering, was it originally written more clearly to be for major? Because right now it covers every kind of.
So I think the term here, major, is undefined and is used kind of synonymously with large. And so it was intended to regulate large-scale development, and so that's when they're kind of using that kind of a major with a small m. And it does very much depend if the piece of land being proposed is 10 acres or more and there's commercial development, yes, it would trigger Act 250.
Right, but even if the project, like, just because it's going to be on this
On
bigger
that
land.
acreage, right.
It's not going to cover that acreage, but
Right.
just any commercial, like if someone owns more than 10 acres and they want to do a small business, they're putting their land, they have to go through the process. So that's been my snag on it, is it doesn't seem to be well written to address that.
To address that major
Yeah.
development.
Yeah.
Yes, and there's all kind of additional nuances that go along with that. So while that list that I presented is kind of the big picture kind of umbrella, when it comes to actually determining whether a project requires an Act 250 permit, there are nuances to it regarding its history. Has it been subdivided? Was it originally part of a lot that was under Act 250 jurisdiction, because at the time it was considered major, and now, because of its history, because of its attached to, or its parent was part of an Act 250 application, it is still required to kind of go through that process.
Yeah.
Maybe just add real quick, now there's major and minor amendments to Act 250 permits, so with the capital M. So that is been refined. you
For
know.
amendments,
So if
once
there's
you
a
get-
small project, whether it's municipal or commercial or housing, well, it can be a minor amendment and go through a much lesser review.
Oh.
So in the mid-80s, we see kind of that reorganization happening at the state level, where that state planning office is now renamed the Office of Policy Research and Coordination. In '88, Act 200 was passed, and this was under the administration, I believe, of Madeline Kunin, and there were some documents I was reading where they kind of referred to this as the golden age of planning. There was a lot of resources and a lot of attention paid to the field of planning, and I think it was around that time that you're seeing kind of the creation of the state planning goals during that time. And a lot of emphasis was kind of put on planning and resources dedicated towards planning. The Planners Association was formed, and in 1990, Act 200 was modified, where originally there was 32 planning goals, and then at that time they were reduced down to 12. But as I've noted there, that we actually now have 14 planning goals. So those have, a few more been added since that time. And just as a reminder, these are the 14 planning goals. I'm not going to read them all, but they are, they start off with that kind of one that we're all probably familiar with, is a planning development around compact villages separated by urban countryside. And what's listed at the bottom are the two ones that have been added since that time that I noted on that time frame. There's been the addition of affordable childcare added as a state planning goal, and following the flooding of Tropical Storm Irene, state recognized we need to do more around planning for the impacts of floods, so they added another one after 2011, where they're saying that now we want to add to that list and say we want to be encouraging flood-resistant communities. So those are the statewide planning goals that are currently in effect. In 1994, there was an enabling language for development review boards. In 1995, the state planning office was dissolved. Between 95 and 97, the municipal planning grants were eliminated. But soon thereafter that they were reinstated. There was this development cabinet that was instituted, and I think that's still on the books, but I'm not quite sure on how active they are. And then in 2004, Act 115 was passed, and there was more revisions to the planning and zoning law. And here, it wasn't until this time that basically the law said, oh, and by the way, now your zoning regulations have to be in conformance with your municipal plan. So now you're seeing that link between regulations being required to under law, be in conformance with the plan that sets the vision. And so kind of as an overview, kind of giving you a sense of kind of what's happening at these different levels, I'm going to start in the middle because that's where we are, the regional planning level. And so as you all are aware, we have a regional plan, and that regional plan is required to show how we are working towards those 14 state planning goals. We don't have any kind of regulatory implementation of our regional plan. And as you're all aware, we offer our technical assistance to our special projects. We are given the authority to review the municipal plans to make sure that they're in conformance with the state requirements, and so that's making sure that they have all the required elements and that they're showing substantial progress towards those 14 state planning goals. It's one of our core statutory responsibilities. And as far as Act 250, we are a statutory party under Act 250. We can weigh in on a development and as it relates to any of those 10 criteria. And then we also have been given the kind of the authority to be able to define what we consider a substantial impact. And so as many of you are aware, within our regional plan, we have a definition of what we consider a project or proposal which would have substantial regional impact. And that is usually, if a project is meeting that definition, that is where we probably are kind of most active. with our project review committee. That's where we'll look more in depth at a project, ask that developer to come in and give a presentation, and then consider what its impacts are under our regional plan. Now, if we go down to the municipal level, as you all are aware, town has a municipal plan, and they have the ability to implement that municipal plan through regulation. So they have the ability to regulate land use. They also have the ability to implement their plan through non-regulatory programs and do special projects. They are the ones that can request their plan be approved by the Regional Planning Commission, and that the municipality has is a statutory party under Act 250, and that municipal plan, if it has very clearly stated goals and policies, will also be kind of considered in the criteria 10 for the conformance with the municipal plan. If we were now to kind of go back up to the top, there is no statewide plan, as we have a regional plan, a municipal plan, and but the state does have some regulatory authority. They have Act 250, they have other permit processes that they administer primarily through the Department of Environmental Conservation. ACCD probably functions more like one of those planning offices that we saw referenced during in the history of planning. They're the ones that they provide technical assistance to towns, and they also provide incentive programs for municipalities, both in the form of grant programs and programs like the Village Center Designation Program, the Downtown Program. Other state agencies have plans, and those can be like plans that are done by the Agency of Transportation, or one that we were kind of engaged in more recently was that watershed plan that was done by DEC. And the Agency of Natural Resources coordinates reviews at the state level on Act 250 applications. And so that's a summary of kind of how things kind of line up from kind of the state, regional, local level with their plans and their regulatory authority. And so what we're happening is that now, in the present, recently, just last year, there was a legislative committee that was actually tasked with re-looking at Act 250, primarily because it hasn't really changed a whole lot since it was first enacted. And there was the sense that, things have changed in Vermont, and maybe it's worth re-looking at this. So I think that kind of sets the stage for the presentation that now Bonnie will give.
Anybody have any questions for Claire? Thank you for an efficient summary, getting us caught up to date on land use planning in Vermont.
Commission on Act 250's report came out. What came with it was some draft proposed for your consideration legislation. And that legislation's been under discussion throughout the session. Some of it is getting more discussion than others, but it's starting to find areas that are commonly discussed in different committees and seem to be the areas that will either progress or not progress. So it seems time to start bringing it to the board and ask you where this board is at on some of these changes. I'm not looking for a very detailed committee position. Sorry, there we go. I'll start there. Let me start here. What the Commission on Act 250, they were a legislative committee with some advisors that they invited to the table. And their legislative charge is what you see up there. But if you look at the white parts, their real charge was to review the vision of Act 250 and its implementations to ensure that Act 250 supports Vermont's planning goals. There are more words, but the white is the condense it down. And what they did, their process, if you will, is that they had a series of preliminary meetings themselves, met with advisors, met with others, had public discussions and meetings around the state, and then took some time to deliberate and develop that report that we linked you to a couple of meetings ago. And I put information there so that you would have it here if you wanted it, but I'm not gonna go through every last word on the screen. And so the first thing they were supposed to do was answer the question, to what degree has Act 250 been successful or unsuccessful in meeting its goals? And what they said was that success has been limited. It's seen some success, but overall it was not as successful as the original writers of the legislation hoped it would be. And then they provided some data to kind of support that cause. And there are many more pages, but essentially the 4 points were that land development has exceeded population growth. So land is being more developed more rapidly than we're actually growing in physical numbers. The impairment of Vermont's waters remains significant for all of our efforts to stop it from happening, and that could mean that it could be much, much worse if we didn't have these things. A significant number of small parcels, so 10 acre or less, are being created, and people refer to that as parcelization, which is essentially, why does that matter? Because creation of small parcels in a rural landscape, that is considered one of the signs of sprawl. Sprawl generally is thought of as eating up the landscape in a way that isn't sustainable for the future. And then the other part is that parcelization undermines the resource-based use that many rural economies rely on. Your agricultural landscape, your forest-based. In Vermont, I would say recreation-based for rural economies. Parcelization makes all of those economic uses less likely to be able to happen. So that's why creation of small parcels was considered a negative. And then last, decline in acres covered by forest. You guys know Vermont's history. We had lots of forest, and then we had virtually no forest, and now we're back to an 80% forested landscape again. But what we're seeing over time is that while we call our number of acres of forest is reasonably stable, the characteristics of those forests have changed dramatically. So we're seeing more brushy forests and less true forest from an old age, health of the forest kind of perspective. And I think that we had Fish and Wildlife here who talked about
Wildlife corridors, interruption of corridors.
Right, I see it.
Yeah, I mean, were they able to clearly connect all of that to Act 250? I mean, I could see the first one definitely falling, clearly,
Right.
under that, it's their fault or their responsibility. But the others could be due to a lot of things, like small parcels could be land costs. People can't afford more than 10 acres, or they can't afford to keep more than 10 acres and pay the taxes, so they are parceling.
The
Did they
full
look at that?
report talked about a number of factors. I took 30 pages and made 4 bullet points. So if you'd like that detail, the end of the presentation, which you have, points you to where you can find the full report. And we could also just email it to you if you want, or post it on our website. But yes, there are a number of factors driving it. Collectively, they said Act 250 hasn't been effective in addressing these things. All right, so what are we trying to do tonight? We're trying to understand a few of the legislative proposals and the discussions and identify the Commission's perspective on changes related to 5 bullet points. And what we're really looking for is, where do we have consensus? What can we say, yeah, this is something I can go to the legislature and talk about and say, CVRPC is on board with this one. Where don't we have consensus? I can't say that yet. And where we don't have consensus, whether there's any way it could be tweaked, adjusted, where we could agree that this is something we want. So there will be the clear no's, potentially the clear yeses, and for anything in between, is there a way that we can talk to the legislature about changing it so that you could support it? I wanted to emphasize that legislation changes from day to day. That's why we're not getting down to a detailed position, because the day you do that, it'll be irrelevant tomorrow when the legislation takes a big jump. Drafts, before crossover, drafts were coming out nearly daily for a while with different changes. And so tonight, we're going to talk about general concepts rather than devils in the detail. And then originally in your board packet, I told you that the Act 250 legislation looked like it was not moving this session. There is a potential that some of the standalone Act 250 bills may move. It's a low potential, but one of them would be the forced integrity bill. And I think the commission has different perspectives on that. That's why I wanted to bring it up in case your communities want to pay attention to that one. So the format tonight is just a real brief introduction to each of these items. Some opportunities for you guys to ask questions to make sure you understand what's being proposed. I'd like to do a straw poll. Do we have any clear yeses or clear nos so that we don't spend a lot of time on something that's in that direction? And then talk about tweaks, your discussion, what you think's happening. Does that work for all of you? Do you think that can get us a position? Okay. All right. So the first one I'd like to talk about are local and regional plan approval and use. And so the proposals here, I'm going to walk out of the way. It's a multi-part, each of them is a multi-part proposal. And so even though it's one text, I'm breaking it out based on those. So for regional plans, the proposals are that once you adopt a regional plan, we must submit it to the Vermont Environmental Review Board, which might be a new or reconstituted board. There are legislative changes about that. They would then review and approve it for statutory consistency. So in the way that the Regional Commission looks at local plans and does statutory consistency, the approval process, the Environmental Board would do it for the regional plan. And what came out of the Commission on Act 250 is no one makes sure that regional plans actually meet statute. And so should somebody be doing that, because they have say in Act 250 and in other locations, or in other parts of, like we can review any state development for conformance with the regional plan. So, and then the last part is, so they must be submitted to the Environmental Review Board for review and approval for statutory consistency, and they must be approved in order for them to be used in Act 250. So essentially, if the regional plan isn't determined to be consistent with statute, you have no standing in Act 250, even though you're a statutory party. So that's what the regional discussion is about. On a municipal discussion, right now statute says that plans may be, local plans may be consistent with statute. They don't have to be. You do not have to do a local plan, and even if you do, you don't have to meet statute, unless you request approval from the Regional Planning Commission. And the reason towns do that is because certain grant programs, you need an approved plan in order to access those grant funds. So that's essentially the state saying, if you want these resources to do things, we need you to contribute to Vermont's planning goals. So legislation would change it from may be consistent to must be consistent, no choice. If you do a plan, you must be consistent. And you must be approved in order to, same as the regional plan, in order for your town plan to have any standing in Act 250, it must be an approved plan. So those are the changes for the plans. They're considered a smaller part of legislation, but since they very clearly affect both the region and the local plan, I was hoping you could have some thoughts on these. Does anybody have any questions, clarifications for these? So some of the questions related to these as you think about straw polling is the Vermont Environmental Review Board the correct board, the right party to review regional plans? So that's not quite the district commission, it's like the appeal group. And if not that board, then who? And I've got some bullet points there. For the municipal plan, well, no, that was the big one. And is there a conflict of interest between this party reviewing plans for conformance and then using those plans to determine consistency with Act 250? So they're both the reviewer of the plan and then use that plan themselves. So those are some of the questions that have come up. So could I ask, from what you know, Vermont Environmental Review Board, Steve, I'm trying to think, or Bob right now, who do we have instead of the Environmental Review Board? You do the District
Natural
Commission?
Resources.
Natural Resources Board, that's what I'm thinking of. So this would replace the Natural Resources Board. And the Natural Resources Board essentially replaced this board a few years ago. So we would go back to that sort of a board. So is that the board that, let me go back. First straw poll is, should regional plans be reviewed for consistency with statute? Is that something this commission supports or doesn't support?
Thumbs up kind of thing.
Yeah, supports?
Support it.
2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, doesn't support? Okay. So if we should be reviewed, who's the party who should review it? And the legislation proposes the Vermont Environmental Review Board. Other parties have said the Agency of Commerce. There are funding stream from the legislature. The Development Cabinet, which Claire referred to, it's not active right now. Governor Scott hasn't chose to use it, but different governors do use it. And the Development Cabinet is essentially the heads of transportation, natural resources, most of the agencies involved in actual development.
Bonnie, can I just ask, do you know how the membership of the Environmental Review Board would be determined? Would it be similar to the one that is in place now?
It's slightly different, and offhand, I don't remember how it is. It's less governor appointed. It might be legislative appointed. Do you know? I'm looking at you because of VPA. Okay. Okay. So I don't know for sure, but it is a slight switch as to who appoints it.
Okay.
Theoretically, it was becoming less political by not having it all be governor appointed. We'll see if that works out. Other parties, the Council of Regional Commissions, which has been removed from statute. That was essentially the RPCs working together with some state agencies. Another party is, could RPCs collectively review regional plans? So essentially peer accountability. Some combination of VTrans, ACCD, and ANR. So the three parties who are most responsible for development and development impacts in Vermont, with 2 or 3 professional planners, not necessarily regional planners. Or that combination with 2 or 3 regional commissions, one of which must be a neighbor to the region being reviewed. So you can see the point here is there can be all different sorts of combinations. Does the commission have any thoughts on, is this the right party, and if not, who is the right party?
Years ago, the Council of Regional Commissions did review and approve regional plans.
Okay.
I don't know whether, I was on the original one, and we had several lawyers on staff, but we weren't lawyers, and so I don't know, you're gonna need a lawyer to review it to make sure it's consistent with statutory.
Well, if you think about it, you determine, as citizen representatives, municipal representatives, you determine if municipal plans are consistent. So do you need a lawyer? That depends on whether you think you do.
Steve?
Well, it might be helpful to, part of the legislation too is to have an appeals process for Act 250 permits to go to the Vermont Environmental
Right.
Review Board, and I mean, I think that's problematic personally, but
Right, we're not going to that one today.
right, okay, that's fine. But yeah, I just think some other model might work better, either state agency representatives or some combination of that and peer review might make more sense than an an appointed government appointed board. But I think anyway, I don't know what other people think. I think it's a work in progress personally.
So I think there's a problem in having a body that is inherently regulatory in nature and has something else as its core function to toss this into their lap. They're going to review it in a regulatory kind of fashion, which is a little different than reviewing it in a planning kind of a fashion. I think it makes more sense to have, just as there is, say, the Downtown Development Board that gets charged to look at things like various designations. It's not an agency per se. It's got a mix of parties that involve, and that is their job. I think that kind of model makes more sense for doing this kind of task.
Other thoughts? All right. So I'm hearing, am I hearing correctly, as a group, yeah, regional approval, that's fine, or approval of regional plans, maybe an alternate body? And any problem with must be approved to be used in Act 250? Does that make sense? We have to meet statute in order to be
Right,
used in
absolutely.
essentially a permitting process. Okay. Municipal plan. Do you support switching from may be consistent to, it's actually shall be consistent? So that municipal plans, you can't just write one and have it not be consistent. It must be consistent with statute, which means you need to address all the goals and all the elements.
Excuse me, Bonnie, I just want to ask a quick question on that first. And my concern would be down the road, looking at it as municipalities without zoning. And if state had some sort of requirement down the road, and now that's contingent upon, federal funding, contingent upon approval, Act 250, and has to meet their, conform to their goals and statutes. I would just be a little concerned with that. And I don't know if there's been discussion on that at all.
Having this move into requirements for zoning, or just how this might be used? I don't think I understood what you were.
Not knowing if we're going into abiding by the state goals as must be consistent with it, if there are goals down the road where
You don't.
somebody's trying to force zoning on towns.
Right.
That's
Okay.
the only concern.
That would be a concern, that this somehow turns into the mandate for
Right.
zoning.
And that would also, affect federal funding for those municipalities if they're not in conformance.
Okay.
It's just a concern. I think that's more maybe future, but I've seen other
Eyes
other
on the
things
horizon.
play out like that too.
Okay. Anybody else on may versus must or shall?
Well, I think if the municipal plans are going to continue having a regulatory effect in Act 250, then they should be consistent with the state goals. I don't think it's fair that one project is stacked up against a plan which does meet the goals, and a project in another town is stacked up against a plan which doesn't meet the goals. So I would advocate for this approach. I think it forces municipalities to have their plans approved by the Regional Planning Commission in essence, right? So I think that's a good thing. Let's all be on the same page. And I think this is a different issue, Rich. The issue of whether municipalities should be mandated to have zoning or not, I think that's a different legislative issue. I don't think a goal is going to, I don't think that's the mechanism whereby the state would require that. I think that's another debate, let me put it that way.
And then, just to be clear, the legislation said they must be consistent. It didn't actually say they must be approved.
Well,
So
you've got to have a way
you can
to,
right.
yeah, there's got to be a way to,
But it doesn't quite
Somebody
say,
has to
and
make
they
that
all must be
judgment.
submitted to the Regional Planning Commission yet. This is where you could easily dive into details, and the legislation's at a very high, let's work out the big picture level. Okay. Any other thoughts on this one? Anybody wanna? Okay,
Yeah, I'd be concerned it's taking away towns' power to, make their own municipal plans. And for the Act 250 process, that would still kick in. It's still the same Act 250 process. Anything, if a town doesn't have, the right plan, they're gonna cripple themselves as far as being able to enforce, their wishes through the Act 250 process, right? The process, though, that project would have to go through would still be the same. If towns, that would be their, it might hurt them and their standing, but the process would be the same, and the construction or project would have to go through Act 250 anyway. So I'd be concerned that that's unnecessarily, it's almost kind of off the subject, it's unnecessarily taking away decision-making power from locals.
Can I just ask a question about, if it's not consistent with state goals, the town would still be able to prepare a town plan and use it as a regulatory plan in their town? They just wouldn't be able to use it in Act 250.
Well,
So-
yes, and this is where the statutory change just says you must be consistent. It doesn't say what happens if you're not consistent.
Right,
Is
okay.
your plan about, all it says is you must be consistent and you must be approved, which is what you get from consistency to be used in Act 250. But it doesn't say what happens if you're not consistent and whether that jeopardizes your local zoning or any other things like that.
So what happens now?
Right.
If it may be consistent now, what if is there
It's
a
the
negative?
town's choice.
Okay.
And the only penalty, if you will, for not being consistent is that you can't access some of the state grant programs that require an approved plan, like community development block grants.
Right, okay.
So,
Bonnie, the state goals, what Claire showed us, the 14.
the 14 goals,
Okay.
right. And it doesn't say with all the elements in statute, it just says, so there are two parts to writing your plan. You have to have certain elements, a transportation element, a housing element.
Forestry.
Right.
Energy.
You have to have those. And
Education.
in addressing those elements, you need to be consistent with the state goals. This just says consistent with the state goals. To do that, you're going to have those elements. But it's just about the goals, not about the elements themselves.
Paula, did you have a question?
Yeah, so the thing that just came up about enforcement, so the 4 points, the gap basically is, am I, tell me if I'm correct, that that gap that exists, the issue, I don't know how, you know what I'm talking about, right? The 4 points that she began with, the parcelization and that. A town can basically go ahead and do, it can do no plan.
Correct.
And all of the only, I don't wanna use the word punishment, but I don't have
The only
another right now.
consequence?
Consequence is lack of funding from the state, but that does not, so if you're Taft Corners, Williston, you're gonna make a lot of money. So why do you care if you don't have that money from the state? And you just do whatever you want.
Because eventually a Taft Corners does want money from the state.
Well, anyway,
Because
is
the development
that-
is overwhelming their
But
system.
is that kind of partly what you're saying? That's where
Yes,
the
they're
gap is?
saying, there are these state goals, this is the state legislature, these are the things all Vermonters, or at least the ones that voted them into office, we all agreed, this is what we want, these goals for the state, that's what we're working towards. And in this, the legislature would be saying, municipalities and regions, if you're going to plan, we want you to pull towards those goals. And you may not be now. And I'll use as an example our regional plan. If you remember in 2015, you did some updates to the regional plan, including a map that we've never had before. That map is required by statute, but we never had them before. Our plan is now compliant with statute. But before that, maybe not so much, but there was no one to hold us accountable. A municipality could have.
Besides yourself.
Besides ourselves and all of you,
Right,
yes, there is
right.
accountability, but not an outside party, if you will. For municipal plans, the accountability is the voters until the municipality seeks that approval, which is basically, region, do a statutory check for me. At that point, the region then becomes the one that determines whether or not they access it, or they meet statute.
Bill, did you have a question?
No, go ahead.
Just to kind of clarify that this would be for the purpose for your plan to be considered under criteria 10 under an Act 250 application. So it's kind of fairly narrow.
Statute didn't actually say that. What the legislation currently says is shall be consistent. And then later it says, if you want your plan used in Act 250, it must also be approved.
Okay.
So there's more nuancing in legislation to go on, but yes, the intent was, we need everybody pulling in the same direction, and you must pull in the same direction if you're gonna participate in Act 250.
Well, go ahead.
It doesn't seem as though this is actually very different from what we're doing now. And also, it seems like if you go through these steps, and you get down to the municipality, and then you've got the consistency all the way through, it doesn't seem that it's limiting to me. It seems that it's a badge that you get of sorts, so that if you are dealing with an Act 250 problem or whatever, the first thing you can do is say, our plan has been approved all the way up. Regional plan has been approved, so we're in line with you, so you have to pay more attention to us than you might otherwise.
This doesn't take away your ability as a municipality to ensure conformance with your zoning regulations right now, right? Claire and Bill, it was aiming it more towards Act 250, but this wasn't just limited to Act 250. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Ron had a,
Maybe I'm getting too picky or too fond at this point, but you can say my plan is consistent with the goals, but who's going to decide how your plan is consistent with the goals? For instance, let's take, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, forest fragmentation. Supposing you have, 80% of your town is forested now, and you say, well, I'm going to prevent fragmentation in in certain areas by allowing some fragmentation in other areas, and I've actually not fragmented the whole thing. Who's going to decide whether that is consistent with the plan or not? Maybe this is jumping a little ahead of the. Maybe I'm seeing problems they come up eventually, but we're not thinking about right now. As I say, it may be several ways to meet the state goal, and they may not always be what seems to be the obvious way. The town may, for instance, find, again with forestry, that if they allow a small area to be fragmented to a little bit, they can prevent some other operation, some other effect on a bigger thing. So being consistent, yes, but I think ultimately someone's going to have to face the question of what is consistent.
right. And right now, the regional commission, you guys decide that for a municipal plan. No one decides it here except you guys as well. Are we consistent?
Bonnie, do I understand this discussion to be that if your plan's not approved, for whatever reason, you didn't ask or it wasn't found to be consistent, that as part of the Act 250 permitting process, your local plan would not be looked at by the district commission to see whether it fit. But that's the first part. The second part is, does lacking an approved plan, does that have any impact on whether or not town select boards and planning commissions would still have standing in the Act 250 process?
So, believe it or not, it's not the select board and planning commission, well,
Yeah, they have party status.
they have
We have
party
party status.
status, but the way they get that status is through the plan. So if the plan doesn't have standing, I believe, my understanding is the town would lose standing in the Act 250 process. It doesn't quite
No, it doesn't
say
say
that. It only says shall be consistent, and you have to be approved to participate.
So basically, if
Yeah.
you, the implication is if you don't have an approved plan, you've got, your municipality has no voice in the Act 250 process.
Not as much.
I think that's the intent. These guys are saying, not so sure about that because you're named parties.
Right.
Yeah, I would be,
We have to change that part of the statute.
I think, I
we'll
wouldn't
be-
want the town to lose all voice in Act 250 just because they're struggling to get to a point where their plan is consistent and approved.
For instance, right now, if you're a planning commission member, or a planning commission or a select board, and you don't have a plan, you still have party status.
You still have party status?
Right.
That's correct.
You just can't point to your plan and say, this project is not consistent with the plan.
You still
That,
have status.
yeah.
You can still ask
Still
questions.
make-
Object,
comments.
ask questions,
Same
and
comments.
Okay.
raise issues.
So it's not about criteria 10. Criteria 10 is a different criteria. Okay. So I will poke around on that one and figure out what the intent is and whether there's an intent to clarify.
Yeah, and what are they trying to fix? Is there
Right.
a problem here with?
They're trying to fix all of us pulling in the same direction towards those same state goals. So think of Claire's
But your town
statistic.
public isn't necessarily.
How much of development actually goes through Act 250? Did you say a quarter to a third, Claire?
Yeah, I think it's like closer to a quarter.
And so by developing some consistency here, that we're all pulling in the same direction, and then for those towns with zoning, your zoning must be compatible with your plan, that's pulling in that direction, so now your zoning's pulling in that direction. Theoretically, that other 75% or 2/3 of developments will be reviewed in a way that helps pull towards those state goals.
It's giving the state more and more and more control over, with a bigger
A bigger
carrot,
stick.
a bigger stick and a
Or
bigger
carrot,
carrot in each
depending on
hand.
how-
Yeah.
Yep. And, sorry.
So I'll ask this question for Richard, our new member from Williamstown. But what about the towns that have no zoning? How does this, what does this portend?
It doesn't do anything with zoning. If you don't have zoning, it doesn't require you to have zoning. It doesn't touch your zoning unless your zoning won't be consistent with your plan. So this is just about the plan right now. And Julie, if you could keep us on track, we might not make it through them all tonight,
You have 10 minutes?
and there's many others we could go through. Okay, are you guys ready to move on? I have a sense
We're ready.
that we're okay with this, maybe a different body.
Yeah.
We're generally okay with this, but we have some questions about what it means for the town's standing in Act 250 as a whole. That we'd like to make sure that standing remains even if the plan itself loses standing.
One more question, Bonnie. Where do we get this out of the information that was sent out? I just keep
So-
looking through and I'm not seeing,
Well,
There is on page, it's scattered, I will tell you that, it's not always in the same place, but there's
because
one.
this is the new law, right?
Okay, turn the
Well, this is
page
a-
on
I
that one.
I kept reading about
This is the current
these
legislation.
enhanced areas. Okay.
So this is already, anything in here, the yellow highlights were particularly related to the things we talked about tonight.
Okay.
Anything that's underlined is a new addition to statute, and anything that's struck out would come out of statute. So on page 14 of the packet, it gets lost because page 13 at the bottom says municipal and regional planning, and then the language actually starts on page 14.
Okay, thank you. That's clarified.
And it
I
may
kept
be
looking through and I said,
scattered
where did we-
somewhere else
I don't
as
remember
well.
reading it. so-
Yeah. It's not all in the same place,
But this is a particular bill,
yes.
Yeah, this-
proposed bill.
And
It's
it's-
H-197, right?
No,
I'm sorry.
actually, this is not
That's-
technically a bill yet. It's a
Pre-bill.
discussion document for the House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee. So it's called 19-0040. So if you go onto the legislative website, usually you can say, show me H-197. You can't search for this. You have to go to the committee's website, and then it'll say, witnesses, documents, and it will say bills. And if you click bills, you can always see the latest draft and old drafts as it changes. So that's the challenge with this one. It's not technically been introduced as a bill. So are we ready to move to transportation? Transportation is simple and complex. The addition is, right now, you deal with roads and capacity, so it would add consideration of bicycle, pedestrian, and other transit infrastructure. And so right now, bicycle and pedestrian are typically considered, but they're not named. And the strength of that consideration has been growing over the past 20 years as Vermont's sidewalk and path network has increased, and Vermont's, the Complete Streets says, you guys have a right to the road in addition to cars. So adding that, and then transit infrastructure right now, typically transit isn't generally considered unless someone raises it as an issue. So Plan Central Vermont that you're working on, one of the things that is in there is it says you shall consult with the transit agency basically before coming to talk to us. Now, it doesn't say you have to do anything other than go have a conversation with them. And then they're going to look at it and say, is this a large enough development? Is it on the transit network? How do we help you be transit friendly? What transit most often finds is developments that work to be transit friendly will put in a bus stop or something like that, and it's set up opposite of the route the bus travels. So even though there's a bus shelter or a stop, the bus can't actually get to it because the bus travels. It's set up on the right and the bus travels to the left. So the idea there in the regional plan, in that new regional plan, was let's have a conversation, and when we do great things, do them in a way that is actually a great thing. So it would add these considerations, and right now it says safe access and connections to adjacent lands and facilities, and the word use was added. So this is about the physical characteristics, access management, physical connections. This becomes about the person using the facility and whether they're safe in that use. This is how we'll call it far, wide, and deep. And this is it enough for me to cross the street? Can I cross the street? I'm trying to think of a particular development, but I shouldn't talk about anything that's in Act 250 right now. So use was added. And then the last part is a change that requires the district commission to state when it declines to require transportation demand management strategies by issuing a finding. So what that means is that right now the district commission, so transportation demand management, what is that? It's also called traffic or travel demand management, and it's basically ways to work to reduce the amount of traffic. Telecommuting is a transportation demand management strategy. I put some others in there. Varied work shifts. So if you've got, I grew up in an area that had a lot of manufacturing and probably had 5 or 6 factories located next to each other. They varied their start times by 10 minutes each, because otherwise all the cars just backed up on the same road and traffic became a snarl. That's a transportation demand management strategy. So Act 250 can impose things like that, and applicants can recommend or choose to incorporate that. But the difference is that right now, they can say, please use these. This flips it and essentially says, we're going to look for you to use these, and we have to justify when we decline to incorporate it. Do you see the flip there? Right now they can choose to consider it. Here they essentially have to choose not to incorporate it and justify why. So it's a flip in thinking that says we want you to use it, and we have to justify why not. So that's the 3 components of the transportation one. Can I do any questions about this before a quick straw poll? And this will be the last one we get to talk about. Okay. Straw poll, yes, it's okay to incorporate bicycle, pedestrian, and other transit infrastructure. Okay, I see about half nods or hands. Can I do,
Hands up.
okay, how about no, we're not gonna do this? Okay, great, thanks. How about safe use, access, and what's my third word? Connections. So this adds the user perspective to the facility design. if you
Sounds
will.
expensive. Sounds like condition.
And vague.
And vague, okay. Yes, I'd love to see this incorporated, or it's okay to incorporate it. Okay. No, I'm not so sure this should be incorporated, or I want more information before I commit to
Steve
that.
says it's too vague.
Too vague, okay, got it. I heard less support for this one. And how about the last one? Flipping the context of essentially justify why you're not doing it instead of, okay, you can choose to do it. Or do we-
I'm not in favor of that. I think that's just asking people to write findings for the sake of writing findings, you know? I see that happening more and more. You have to have a finding. I mean, it's one of the problems I had with the consultant who was working on our town plan and zoning is causing a DRB to have to write a finding for every single thing that they do. And you know, on the surface it sounds good, but it's just a lot of administration for nothing.
Okay.
And I have a problem with that.
So Bob mentioned on the surface it sounds good. It is aimed at starting to develop consistency in decision-making. You should see the same types of reason happening. But you have to write the finding every time.
Yeah.
That's just my opinion.
Sort of going along with what Bob said, as I read some of these other plans, you get maybe one or two towns that does that in detail, and it's a great ease for the consultants just to copy the wording without their particular situation. I mean, they can copy the general word, we want to do this, and you may be in a region where it sounds like you should, but you physically can't. So I think just requiring a reason, you're going to see a lot of the same reasons for declining or accepting. And it doesn't mean it applies to that. As I said, I read through some of these and other plans. There's a tendency, it sounds good, it worked for town A. Oh, it's all it worked for us. And I think that gets very wordy and sort of doesn't really get to the solution. So there should be some reason that they give to decline it, but it should be, I don't know how to put this, a reason they can justify for their particular situation. So I'm not sure that's a good thing to put in that way without clarification.
Okay. Are you waving at me to stop? Or?
No, I have a comment on this. I think context is really a challenge for me in looking at this. There are places where transportation demand management absolutely should be looked at. But we are not all Burlington and South Burlington.
Yeah.
And frankly, I can't really imagine the kind of thing that might happen in East Montpelier that would require transportation demand management. And so it does seem like it's, in theory, the consideration is a good one, but I think we're just, it's busy work in an awful lot of places.
So flipping it makes more work without a substantial benefit to the majority of the state.
But wouldn't the light that East Montpelier put in between Route 14 and Route 2, wasn't that kind of a product of transportation demand management? Because that was a hell of a place to get on or off on at different
So
times.
that's not so much the demand in terms of how do you shift the amount of traffic and have it be sort of spread out a little more or have less of it. So transportation demand management might be usually involved trying to do things to not have so much congestion all at one time, or not have to deal with having acres and acres of parking, so maybe you can share, do some other sorts of things. The place I know the transportation demand management is used is for the Hill institutions, the university and the hospital in Burlington, where they just can't have everybody arrive at the same time and drive their own car. They don't have the room, they don't have any of that. So there's all these different ways they use to try and sort of not have everybody drive their car. But does East Montpelier need those things?
In a rural area, some examples, if you look way over there, use of transit. So can people get access to transit? So East Montpelier has a park and ride right in its village where the bus stops. That's access to transit. It stops cars from continuing on, theoretically, if they're riding the bus, they're not continuing on their journey. So further down the road, traffic is reduced because of that strategy. Sidewalks are a transportation demand management tool as well, because you're giving people a choice other than being there in their car. So this is about an option to driving in your car, or to counterbalance the incentives to drive. So, okay. So I'm hearing, not so sure about this one here, and whether it's applicable. I'm hearing a clear no here. Okay, thank you. That gives me some direction, legislative conversations, ways to tweak it, and that also allows, as the legislation changes, it gives me some perspectives about whether you might go with those changes or not support those changes based on the conversation we had today. So I'm going to stop there because my time's up. And then at a future meeting, if you'd like, we can dive into energy, interstate interchange, which Ron had someone contact him about, an enhanced designation. These are the easy ones. When we start diving into appeals and forest integrity and some of those others, it's more than 3 bullet points. It's a substantial change to how, forest integrity especially, is a substantial change to how Act 250 works. Right now, just as a preview, right now Act 250 works, you have a development, what's its impact? The proposal for forest integrity says, we have a resource, what's your impact? So it changes, kind of like this one, it changes the flow. And jurisdiction would be triggered by being in that resource area. So a subdivision of 4 houses might end up in Act 250 because they're in a core forest block. So that one's particularly under discussion. It is also the one most likely to pass.
So I've found this discussion helpful in terms of understanding what some of these issues are and getting me to think about how does this impact what the Regional Planning Commission does, how does it impact what my town does. I'm wondering for everybody else you'd like to have more of this discussion. It sounds like there is plenty more of these issues and they're timely and relevant. And if we were to pick some of this up again at our next meeting, would that be good? I'm seeing some heads nod. Okay.
We could have 6 months of Act 250 with all the proposals. So we're going to try and aim at the big ones that either might move or, like the plans, are more directly impacted to everybody in the room. If you see a particular topic you want us to tackle, let me know.
If forest integrity is one that looks like it might actually pass, maybe that would be nice.
One to talk about. I wanted some warm-up, I have to admit. To make sure that how I envisioned you would talk about it was actually working for you. So, okay, thanks. So I'm going to cut it off there.
Would you be willing to share your PowerPoint that's in color?
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Yes. And I gave you, what I gave you had the notes so you could start in case you want to take it for next time. The other thing we had that Pam put together for me is the one about interstate interchanges. When you look at that, anything within 3,000 feet of an interstate interchange would fall under Act 250. And so she put together some really nice maps that you might be interested in. Red, never mind.
It was right there.
The red circle tells you what 3,000 feet looks like in your community.
So Bonnie, are we ready to move on?
We are. So if you'd like to see that, let me know. I can email you the maps.
Nice job, Bonnie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks.
So we have some businessy type things to deal with this evening as well, which is why I can't let Bonnie run on. And as interesting as it is, one of the things we are trying to do is make sure that all of the regional planning commission's committees has formal rules of procedure. We've looked at any number of these over the last couple of years. And we have one tonight, which is for the Town Plan Review Committee. The proposed rules of procedure is on page 29 in your packet. I'm going to quick ask Claire, this has been put in front of the committee, is that correct?
Yes, at the last meeting of the Town Plan Review Committee, they reviewed this and approved to forward it on to you for formal approval or adoption. And the main change, other than some kind of reorganization, some reformatting, was basically the addition of number 2 under the purpose statement. We added that upon request by the municipality, review municipal plans for consistency with the municipal enhanced energy planning requirements. So that's the one significant change that has been added to ensure that the policy reflects the additional task of the committee based on the legislative changes.
Okay. So the committee has said this is okay, but it is incumbent on the full Board of Commissioners to actually approve these rules of procedure. Is somebody willing to make a motion?
The commission approve this?
Okay.
As written.
Okay, so motion by Bill. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Rich Turner. Any discussion? All in favor of approving the Town Plan Review Committee Rules of Procedures, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. Next up, we have a report from the Nominating Committee, and Byron.
Yes. Well, it was an honor to be part of that committee, but it was especially good to have a couple members such as Alan Quackenbush, Duxbury, and Bob Wernick Berlin on the nominating committee. And I'd also like to special thanks to Nancy for taking the minutes at the CVRPC office. Much appreciated. So after during our meeting, what we have for the initial slate for the executive committee for the commission's consideration is for at-large position Julie Potter, East Montpelier, as the ex-chair, typically moved into an at-large position to help in the...
I like past chair. It sounds better than ex.
Past.
It doesn't make me feel so
Well, you're still the
inspired.
present chair. The present chair, at the end of fiscal year 19, she moves...
Yes.
Yes, okay, I'm sorry. But I'd also like to just say about Julie, that I would like for every commissioner to really have an appreciation of how much time and energy and effort she has put into this, drilling down onto every subject possible, doing all kinds of structural work to help the RPC be greater transparency, more effective moving forward, and I just think everybody should really appreciate the fact we've had an extremely active chair for the last couple of years, and thank you so much, Julie. There are 3 at-large positions. The next position, we nominated Jerry D'Amico from Roxbury. Jerry is meticulous about attending meetings, bless you, and very well-rounded character. The 3rd at-large position, Janet Shatney, Berry City. And I just want to say to Janet, thank you, because Janet, if no one else had been willing to step into the vice chair position, Janet was ready to. And I just want to say thank you for doing this out there. Next, Dara Torrey, Moortown. She's a secretary, which is a position that she's been in the last year or two. And Michael Gray, Woodbury for treasurer. And I just wanted to make it clear to the commission and all commissioners that because both of those individuals are extremely busy in their private lives, that wanted to maintain those positions, but not move into a more demanding vice chair. And I just say that for complete transparency and everyone's knowledge and understanding. For vice chair, we nominated Steve Lotsby, Waterbury. Steve's expert in many subjects in planning, and I think would be an excellent vice chair. And then, of course, as the chair, Laura Hill Eubanks, Northfield. That's our slate.
Thank you. Appreciate the work of the nominating committee. Our bylaws say that the nominating committee brings an initial slate for the board's consideration. The following month, which will be May, the nominating committee brings their final slate for board consideration, and we also allow nominations from the floor. At the end of next month's meeting, we will close that process. There will be an election balloted. You'll get the ballot in the mail. And the results will be announced then at the June meeting. And then we'll have new people. So, any questions about that? Okay. Related, not just what happens in executive committee, but what happens in all the rest of the other committees, has to do with how we try and get people onto the various committees that the Regional Planning Commission has. And I am going to hand this off to Laura because this currently falls to the vice chair to sort of figure out how to do this.
And she enjoys every minute of it. So I'm gonna just run through the committees quickly. I'm gonna sort of skip over executive and nominating. I think we all had Julie explain how that works, and we don't really need appointments to be made to those because the executive gets elected. I'm just going to talk about the committees that we need appointments for this year, and I'm going to start with project review. We need 2 appointments this year, 2 members. Their terms are up and they're not going to seek to be reappointed. Basically, this committee looks at project review, it looks at Act 250 and Section 248 permit applications for development projects and determines conformance with the regional plan and offers recommendations for projects that may have a substantial regional impact. There are 5 members and 1 alternate member. The term is 3 years, and we have 2 appointments to be made. The next is the Regional Plan Committee. That has been staffed already for 2-year term, and those seats, as far as I know, the members will stay on until 2020. So I don't think we'll be looking for new members for that unless someone decides they do not want to stay on the committee. The Town Plan Review Committee, there are 5 appointments to be made because this is only a 1-year term. And the Town Plan Review Committee looks for conformance with requirements of state statute and reviews the town's planning process. So we are looking for 5 members, and actually we're looking for an alternate member, I believe, because we did not fill that last time. Is that true? An alternate? Yeah, we should be looking for 5 members and 1 alternate. I'm going to skip Transportation Advisory because that is appointed by the town, so if you're interested in being a town representative, you can ask your town manager or select board to see if you can be appointed to that. Brownfields Advisory, let's see, the terms are 2 years and the current members aren't expiring until 2020, but there is an alternate seat that's still available if anyone is interested in that. That committee oversees the Brownfields Development Program. I think we're winding down on a grant right now, but we probably will.
We'll hear about whether or not we have a new award in the April or in the May-June timeframe. And if we do get another EPA grant award, the committee will ramp back up.
Okay, something to look forward to for next year.
Fall, yes.
Yep. And lastly is Clean Water Advisory Committee. And that is a committee that has outside members as well as commissioners. I should have said the Brownfield Advisory Committee is set up the same way. So that will be looking for 2 appointments. The terms are 2 years, and the current members' terms, let's see, wait a minute. Term is 2 years, and there are 2 seats to be appointed this year, 1 member and 1 alternate member. And they will work on policy and directions for the CVRPC's Clean Water Program support. So if any of you are interested in any of these committees, you can sign the sheet that's in your packet, or you can sign the sheet that's in front of you and bring it up to us after the meeting is over. And I think being on a committee it's fun. It usually is fun. You get to meet people, you can make new friends, and you can see how things work in other towns. And I've learned a lot about the region being on committees. I really do enjoy it. So I hope you'll all consider being on a committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ideally, we'd like to have everybody serve on a committee, just partly so that you're engaging with each other and you're a little more engaged with what the work that the Regional Planning Commission does. Certain things happen here, staff do certain things, but an awful lot of work gets done that's really important to what the Regional Planning Commission is about. It gets done at the committee level. So, we are kind of getting caught up. Which means you can talk about reports. Next up is our approval of the meeting minutes. This is on page 34 in your packet. These are the meeting minutes from March 12th. So I will ask first, did anybody see anything that they thought needed corrections? Not hearing that. Okay.
I'll make a motion to approve minutes.
We have a motion by Bob Wernick. Do we have a second? Seconded by Don LaHaye. Any discussion? All in favor of approving the March 12th meeting minutes, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. Last up, we have reports in your packet, starting on page 37 or so. We have staff reports. These are always interesting. I will remind you, if you haven't been reading them, you learn an awful lot about what the RPC is working on, particularly in other towns. And more than once I've looked at it and said, gee, my town could use one of those. So this is an opportunity to sort of spot whether there's something that maybe you want to bring back to your town, or ask staff whether there's an opportunity for your town to participate. I did have a quick question when I was taking a look at this. On page 42, there's a reference to BADC, but I have no idea what that is.
My apologies. Berry Area Development Corporation. So it's Berry Town and City's Economic Development Organization.
And the other question I have is under the Thrive. You say CVRPC's Thrive participation resulted in all 3 of the following partnerships for progress, but I'm not sure which of those 3 you're talking about.
That might have been left from last month, but it was the Medical Center's Community Health Needs Assessment, the Hunger Council Food Access Mapping Project, and in the previous month, the 3rd one was Capstone's Community Needs Assessment. So in networking with those groups and participating in their discussions, we're finding things those groups can help the Regional Commission achieve, and they're finding things we can help them achieve. And together, all of those things add up to better services for your communities.
Super. We also have in the packet, starting on page 44, the Executive Director's Report. Bonnie went away and came back with lots of ideas and thoughts.
So I find that sometimes people say, well, what are these conferences good for? Because in this case, we're flying to Washington DC, it's not exactly low cost to go there. Planes, yes, hotels, no. So it seemed important to occasionally tell you what I'm bringing back as a result of that. And our communities are talking a lot about opioids. And the term now, the medical term is substance use disorder. It is an actual medical recognized condition because as you use those substances, they physically change your brain chemistry. So even if people want to get off, I think I put some of this in here, but the research is showing it takes at least 5 years to successfully transition off. And right now we allow 30 days of treatment. And so research is showing a real disconnect between how we actually overcome substance use disorder and what we do. And so the medical community, the social services communities, and I'm betting the rest of us will eventually lean in that direction. The really frightening statistic was that in 5 years, 30% of our labor force is expected to have substance use disorder. Not be affected by it, meaning a family member, but 30% of people who could be working or are working will have that disorder. That's some pretty exponential growth starting to happen.
Just as a footnote, you may remember that last month when Eileen Peltier was here from Down Street, she talked about substance use disorders. And that was the first time I've heard of that terminology. She talked about it in the context of housing and services with housing for folks who needed some additional support.
So if you talk about as a state level, we often talk about the Agency of Human Services budget, which is a large part of Vermont's budget. This suggests that it's going to have impacts beyond social services into the Department of Labor, into economic development, into the workforce. So it's going to affect, or it is affecting, public and private employers, whether it's always visible or not. That is why regional planning is talking about this.
Don?
Did you have any discussion about the antidote for the opioids and what effect that may have had?
We did not.
Good or bad?
We did not. Other than it's a substitute. And so it's considered better than the opioid itself.
I'm talking about the antidotes.
Oh, no, we didn't discuss those. This was more a researcher presenting some of the findings they're doing and focusing on labor force participation. He had 5 different areas they looked at, but he just talked about the labor force one.
And also in your packet, I'm assuming you're done.
Yep.
Okay, also in your packet on page 45 is the committee reports. And if you are thinking about, what has this committee been working on? What do I want to be interested in participating in next year? This is the right place to take a look and find out. Does anybody have any questions on any of these reports?
Julie, just point out on the meeting dates, you get times, the wrong times for both the Board of Commissioners and the Transportation Advisory Committee.
Thank you.
One's, you got the Board of Commissioners at 7, we're now 6:30, and the TAC at 6, and it's 6:30.
Thank you very much for that. There's a lot of juggling that comes together to try and get these
I
things done,
understand
but
that,
it's
but we
good to
keep
have
using
somebody
the same
touch it.
things, and so let's get them.
Right.
So, is there any other business that we need to address this evening? If not, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Don has made that motion. Do we have a second? I heard Alan, okay. No discussion on this. All in favor of adjourning, say aye. Aye. Thank you very much. We will see you on May 14th.